Thanks, and thank you to Nick for organising this fine workshop, and to Jessica for giving us the occasion. So, title is Metaphysical Causation, and the punchline is probably not too far away for you to see. I'm going to argue that we should think of grounding as a kind of metaphysical causation. In fact, I'm tempted by the view that grounding just is causation as it kind of applies in the metaphysical domain, and I'll explain what I mean by that as I go on. Just a kind of brief bit of background. I'm going to present this as if I'm a grounding fan and I'm giving a kind of new, potentially plausible theory of what grounding is, but that wasn't how I got into this. I got into this because I kind of didn't like the notion of grounding, and I wanted to try and put my finger on exactly what I didn't like about it. And there'll be a diagnosis later on in the talk as to what's wrong with grounding. And yeah, I remember the happy days when I started doing metaphysics, where you could go, a whole year of metaphysics talks without anybody using the word. And now grounding seems to be everywhere. There's a sense in which, because I don't really like grounding very much, I think that's a bad thing, but I also think it's kind of a good thing that we have the dirty laundry out in the open, because it was still kind of there in the background, and now at least we can have a kind of grown-up conversation about it, rather than kind of trying to pretend that there aren't tricky questions there in the first place. Okay, so what am I going to do? Very quickly sketch grounding. Hopefully most of you know what the topic is supposed to be. And then the kind of positive thing I'm going to do is talk about the connection between grounding and causation, and use the connection between grounding and causation, which I think is a fairly deep-running one, to motivate a certain way of thinking about grounding based on a way of thinking about causation that has turned out to be quite useful in terms of interventionist counterfactuals. And much of the talk is going to be kind of introducing that account of grounding, trying to make it look like it does what grounding fans want it to do, and in the process of kind of trying to support the similarity between grounding and causation, I'm going to look at some particular cases of grounding that you can represent in this kind of causal model style. And here I'm drawing on some recent work which was done in parallel with some work of Jonathan Schaffer. So it turned out that we both have written really quite similar papers about using causal modeling techniques to understand grounding. So I'm going to look at some of those metaphysical causal models. I'm going to talk very briefly about the connection with counterpossible counterfactuals. I think this is really a really interesting feature of this approach to grounding, that kind of highlights this feature of grounding claims, and it's that which I think I want to put my finger on as a major reason that people resist taking grounding seriously. This is my kind of diagnosis of why so many people are skeptical about grounding, and you can either you could buy the diagnosis while kind of either adopting that reason for skepticism or not. And then I'll talk a bit about the end about this actual kind of positive identity thesis for those people that do want to take grounding seriously, aren't worried by its connection with counterpossible counterfactuals. It's a kind of causation. That's going to be the view I'll explore at the end. Okay, so what's grounding? Hopefully you have a good sense of this already. Just a couple of things to say about it initially. It's meant to be explanatory, and this is both kind of one of the most basic things we know about grounding and also one of the most puzzling things about it. And Fine puts it in this really, I think, not very helpful way when he says ground is an explanatory relation. And I can think of several ways of kind of disambiguating that. But I think Fine's probably trying to be deliberately unspecific here. But what it at least points to is that you can explain by giving the grounds of something. So if you want to explain why this chair is red, I mean, these chairs are all black, but suppose there was a red chair here, you can explain why it's red by citing the causal process that led to it being red, or you can explain why it's red by citing the specific determinate shade of red that it is, and it is red. The way it is red is by being that specific shade. So I'm introducing this by this contrast between grounds and causes. Ultimately, I think that distinction is one that we can question, but A very common way of introducing grounding is just to give a load of examples and hope that people kind of grab onto something that the examples have in common. So I'm not going to read them all out. Here are some of the classic examples. Some people think that truth making is a kind of grounding. I'm going to use a model where it is. There are these kind of logical grounding cases that Fine likes. There's this classic example of singleton sets being grounded in the existence of singleton sets being grounded in the existence of their members. And then some more controversial ones here. I mean, along with being controversial, I think goes being more interesting. So these are more controversial and more interesting grounding claims. Again, I'm not going to rely on any of them actually being true, but these are just the kinds of things that a theory of grounding should let us do justice to. Maybe if one or two of them can't be fit into a particular scheme, that would be okay. But if very few of them fit into a particular scheme, good reason to think that we haven't captured what was intended by grounding fans in the first place. So I formulated all of these in terms of a relation between facts. And although some of these claims, maybe even most of these claims, would be true when given the full ground reading, for most of the talk, if I just say ground, I'll be talking about partial ground, but in finest terms, it's strict ground. So the standard view on this is that strict partial ground, indeed strict full ground, but just for now, strict partial ground is a partial order. So antisymmetric, transitive, and irreflexive. See in a minute that we can challenge these logical properties. So that's the kind of the standard way grounding gets introduced, by some gesture in the direction of explanation and some examples. And various people have thought that's not enough for us to get a grip on the notion. We need more, you might think, than just a list of examples and some kind of vague motivating talk to give us a grasp on something that's meant to be really, really important in metaphysics. So two kinds of ways to worry about grounding, two kinds of routes to grounding skepticism. One of them, this route that just denies that kind of it's possible to explain grounding to people that don't understand it. So you can develop that Hofweber's way and say, well, grounding fans might understand grounding, but I don't, and there's nothing they can say to me that will help communicate the notion of ground to me. And so grounding is this, he calls esoteric notion, and argues that we shouldn't be using esoteric notions in metaphysics. And Chris Daly has a similar skeptical line about grounding that's again based primarily on intelligibility. And I don't find this way of resisting grounding a particularly promising route. Even if we don't understand grounding in full generality, we certainly understand what's going on in a lot of those examples. And we seem to understand the word because as it's used in English when it's not obviously being used in a kind of in the familiar causal way, one thing knocking into another and causing it to fall over. So I think it's entirely plausible to think that there's kind of no intuitively understood notion in the vicinity of grounding. Maybe it needs to be precisified a bit. But even then, even if our folk notion of grounding is kind of underspecified or confused in various ways, I think you need some reasonably meaty premises from philosophy of mind or language if you want to kind of argue that the notion is not just unintelligible to us now, but cannot be made intelligible at all. And you might well think that asking whether it's intelligible is just the wrong thing to do. You shouldn't ask whether it's intelligible, you should ask whether it's useful. Kind of grant intelligibility, and then resist at the level of the question, is this something that we should put to serious work in metaphysics? So I don't find those sorts of critiques very compelling. I prefer the kind of critique that Jessica's given, which is to say that there's no distinctive grounding notion that kind of covers all of the specific examples that are given. So going back to the examples, there are genuine truths expressed by these claims, but there's no single notion of grounding, which just calls big G grounding, which kind of brings them all together under a common heading. So maybe some of these are true when we read grounds in terms of counterfactual dependence. Maybe some of them are true when we read grounding in terms of supervenience of some kind. Maybe other of them kind of correspond to the determinable relation. But anyway, there's a kind of ragbag of notions here, and it's just a mistake to try and bring them all together under one heading. So I'm fundamentally inclined to agree with this, but I'm going to be exploring how you would go about disagreeing with this if you wanted to disagree with it. And I think the best thing you can do in arguing that all of these notions really should be thought of under one heading is to bring them under one heading where that heading is causation. And that's what I'm going to be doing. So initial clue that maybe causation has something to do with it, as well as having the same logical properties as strict partial grounding. It also looks like there are analogous challenges to these logical properties. So there are these classic examples of apparently non-transitive causation, and Schaffer's offered these parallel examples of apparently non-transitive ground. And he diagnoses both of these as the result of not having a suitably contrastive notion of causation or ground, and offers a contrastive account of each notion to solve the problem. But there are other ways of kind of responding to this worry that again are available in each case. So you can bite the bullet in each case, or you can deny the premise, the relevant premise for a kind of relevantly similar reason in each case. Okay, I don't really want to talk about the cases. It's just a kind of there are analogous kinds of counterexamples in both cases. Likewise for asymmetry. So there are these familiar time travel cases of apparent causal loops, and I think there are equivalent kind of grounding loop cases you can come up with. This is just one example, this truth teller kind of thing. But in this paper, it's actually forthcoming now, Naomi Thompson gives several kinds of examples of apparent grounding loops, and you only need one to work to get asymmetry being falsified. But I don't need to kind of pin my colours to any of these cases. The point really is just that you can raise challenges in the same sort of way. So what does this suggest? It suggested to me at least that there was something deep that was in common between grounding and causation. And so investigative techniques that prove useful in the case of causation might also prove useful in the case of grounding. And the basic investigative technique is counterfactuals. Think about causation by thinking about what kinds of counterfactuals particular causal relations entail or support. And that seemed to work quite well. We've got there's a whole tradition of understanding causation in counterfactual terms. So why not try the same thing with grounding? Simplest possible counterfactual account of causation is this Lewisian one. So it's just the ancestral of counterfactual dependence. Counterfactual dependence is had not Q been the case, then not P would have been the case. And this is just Hume's definition of cause. So in the grounding case, if A grounds B, then had A not been the case, B would not have been the case. So the kind of, try this test out. You seem to get some true counterfactuals, at least in some of the easy cases I've chosen. That seems right. The problem comes when you start looking at the reverse dependencies, because causation is meant to be asymmetric at least most of the time. And so if we want asymmetric causal dependencies, we're going to have the counterfactuals being true in one direction and false in the other. And these look kind of true as well. They're harder to get your head round, but insofar as you can get your head round them, I think most people think they look true. So this, I'm not going to go into the details of this debate over backtracking counterfactuals. But the point is that this issue with apparently true reverse counterfactuals is familiar from the case of causation. So it's kind of one of the most immediate problems with your standard counterfactual analysis of causation on Lewisian lines is that it seems to have, the reverse counterfactuals seem to come out true, so it seems like you have backwards in time causation falling out of the account. And Lewis obviously didn't want that. And so the point is, it's not, I'm not going to go into this. There are kind of linguistic tests you can do, and I think some of the reverse grounding counterfactuals come out the same way as reverse causal counterfactuals according to linguistic tests. But the point is just that given that it's not fatal to a counterfactual account of causation, that these reverse counterfactuals seem to come out true, it shouldn't be taken to be fatal to an account of grounding in terms of counterfactuals either, because we can make the same kinds of moves in the grounding case as in the causal case to restore the adequacy of the analysis. So skip backtracking counterfactuals and their semantic features. We can come back to that if you want. I'm just going to skip a lot of history of counterfactual theories of causation and go straight to interventionism. So interventionism is still a kind of counterfactual theory of causation, but it's not a simple counterfactual theory in the familiar way. So the counterfactuals that get used in interventionist theories of causation are specific kinds of counterfactuals that say you intervene on certain variables, and then so that the antecedent says intervene on certain variables, and the consequent says some other variables take some other values. So that's a very restricted range of counterfactuals that are being associated with causal claims now. And you don't just give an account of causation in terms of those counterfactuals. You also need to specify a causal model to kind of assess the counterfactuals. And the causal model includes this stuff. So it includes some variables with their various possible states, some values for each variable, and some structural equations that link the variables. And you can draw pictures of these causal models, but the pictures sometimes miss out some of the structure. So really, this is what a causal model is. It's something that has this sort of structure. And just like you can put cases of causation into this framework, you can put cases of grounding into this framework too. So I'm going to go through a few models quickly. This is a standard causal case. Plant dies because you don't water it. So it's a case of causation by omission. You can have grounding by omission too. So the set of unicorns is empty because there are no unicorns. P is false because P fails to be the case. Sorry, the sentence P is false because P fails to be the case. And you can keep going, and there are lots of cases of causation which have been used as puzzle cases in the causation literature, and you can get grounding cases which also have these puzzle case form. So here's a case of double prevention, which again has caused problems for kind of energy transfer theories of causation, because you seem to kind of have a disconnect between the cause and the effect, because all the cause does is preventer, so it kind of indirectly causes the effect. So this is a classic example from Ned Hall, but you can have grounding cases too. So whether or not this, so the switch, oh God, it's so long since I talked through this example, I'm trying to remember what it is. So the circuit is live because the switch is on. The switch being on prevents the switch from being an insulator, and the switch being an insulator prevents the circuit from being closed. It's a fanciful example. The thought behind this one is that kind of minds are constituted by matter. So the kind of the default thing is going to be for physicalism to be correct. But had zombies been metaphysically possible, that would have screwed with physicalism being correct. So it's the failure of any possible worlds to contain zombies that is grounding the correctness of physicalism here. I mean, this is a very, very simplified picture of the dialectic, but these sorts of things should be constructible. And so overdetermination cases, two guards overdetermining the death of a prisoner. Here we've got some grounding cases, two poisons in a potion overdetermining the fact that that potion is poisonous, or P being the case and Q being the case, overdetermining that P or Q is the case. Early preemption, more trouble cases. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, maybe just long enough. This is one of the nicer cases maybe. It's kind of the fact that all of my particles are here and arranged in the way they are trumps the fact that all my particles except for these ones are arranged here in the way they are in constituting a person. So if you got rid of these particles, the rest of my particles will still constitute a person. But as it happens, that subset, without the finger particles, don't constitute a person because they're a kind of better candidate in the vicinity. At least this is the way that people that solve the problem of the many in this kind of maximality way, the kind of the maximal, the F in the vicinity is the kind of maximal F. And here's a case of whether the laws determine that you are guilty of a crime based on what you've done. It's because you're guilty of murder that you're not guilty of assault, but because you should be found guilty of murder, you shouldn't be found guilty of assault. Kind of murder trumps assault in the charges list. So you would be found guilty of should be found guilty of a crime. It would have been that you should have been found guilty of the crime because you assaulted the victim, but because you actually killed them, that trumps, that it's because you killed them that you should be found guilty of a crime, not just because you merely assaulted them. So we kind of have a trumping thing going on here. And this is a case that will kind of come up later in the argument that grounding is a kind of causation. It seems like you can mix up these kinds of connections into single causal models. So here, the batting team is all out, but that's a combination of connections that are causal connections and grounding connections. So some of these arrows are mediated by the laws of cricket, some of them are mediated by the laws of physics, basically. Okay, so that was a really quick tour through the kinds of models you can build, doing a theory of grounding in this structural equations kind of way. Maybe I should just say briefly how to understand these causal models for people that aren't familiar with them. What an intervention would amount to. So an intervention is a changing of a value of a variable or some variables. And the key thing to remember about interventions is that when you're assessing interventionist counterfactuals, what you do is you make your intervention on the model, and then you carry through the consequences of the equations of the model, but only in one direction. So if you were to intervene on this variable P, so preventing the wombat from swallowing the plant, you would change that to 0, so the wombat doesn't swallow the plant. You've intervened to prevent that happening. And then your intervention kind of gets carried through upstream. So because the wombat didn't swallow the plant, hang on, where are we? I've chosen a bad variable to intervene on there. that makes it more complicated than necessary. Just try this one. Intervene on whether the guard A fires. You change that A to 0. And then when you're determining what value E takes, you use A as having value 0, but you don't, hang on, what's going on here? That should be 1, 2, I'm sorry. These slides are much more of a mess than I remember. It was 1 in the other ones. Okay, let me try and say this in a way that doesn't appeal to things that might be wrong on the slides. If you have a causal model, and you decide to kind of intervene on this variable here, so you kind of come in from the outside and change the value of that variable. What you do is you leave the upstream ones, like this one, unaffected. So this one doesn't have its value changed. But you do carry through the new value of this variable through these connections, so you end up altering this one and that one. So the new state of the model would be one where this is different, that's different, that's different, but this is still the same because it's an upstream variable. And that difference between implementing the changes downstream but not upstream is going to be really important later. Okay. And so what you do to assess interventionist counterfactual, suppose the antecedent says you intervene on this variable. You feed that intervention in to the model, end up with the variable values here different too, and then you check whether the consequent is true by checking whether the variable values described in the consequent are true of the resulting network you've got after you've carried through all the changes. And that will give you truth values for the various interventionist counterfactuals. And then interventionists give a story for judging whether particular causal relations obtain based on what truth values the particular kinds of interventionist counterfactuals have. And what they'll say about this sorts of account of causation is that it's not a reductive account. So in particular, the notion of intervention is itself a causal notion. Furthermore, the account needs to have causal models put in by hand. So you associate a causal model with a particular scenario, and only then are you in a position to read off the various causal relationships in the vicinity. So it's not like what Lewis was trying to do, where he's trying to give an account of, well, initially trying to give an account of what causes what that didn't appeal to any prior causal judgments. So interventionists embrace this. They say it's a non-reductive theory, and it will kind of tell you how some causal claims are related to other causal claims. And I want to say, if that is a legitimate methodological move for causation, it's also a legitimate move for grounding. So we could give the same sort of theory of grounding, present it as a non-reductive theory, but still an informative one nonetheless. And so that's the kind of the view I'm going to be offering to grounding fans. So, okay, I shouldn't go on for too much longer. See how quickly I can get through the rest of this. So there's a lot that grounding and causation have in common. They have the same logical properties, at least at first pass. They have this feature that they can be cited in explanations. You can connect them in this way to patterns of asymmetric patterns of counterfactual dependence. You get the same sorts of puzzle cases when you do. You can deal with these puzzle cases in a lot of ways if you use the resources of the interventionist analysis, which you need to think of non-reductively in both cases. There's something spooky about them. Empiricists tend to be suspicious of causation, Hume, and anybody that's suspicious of causation is going to be doubly suspicious of grounding. Maybe grounding is somehow even more unwelcome than causation. I think it is, and there's good reason for that for an empiricist. But they still have this kind of, it goes beyond the categorical occurrent facts in a certain sense. You can't kind of directly observe the grounding relation holding in any given case. And And this is, I think, so important that I've given it a bullet of its own. One of the things I think that I find most convincing about this analogy between causation and grounding is a similarity of the notion of full ground with sufficient cause. And I mean, I'm tempted to say that's just what full ground is. It's the grounding analog of causal sufficiency. No doubt there are some reasons why that won't work, but I find this thought so compelling that I'd be inclined to hold on to it and reject things that would be incompatible with it unless they're really, really obvious things. So we'll see how we go in Q&A. But yeah, so sufficient cause seems to form a partial order, and so does contributory cause. Likewise, partial ground seems to form a partial order, but so does full ground. So there's kind of two separate partial orders here in both cases. In the causal case, sufficient and contributory, and in the grounding case, partial and full. Okay, so there's a kind of a framework for thinking about grounding using these theoretical materials that have been developed for thinking about causation. I focused on the analogies. Obviously, there are some disanalogies. And I think the most important disanalogy is this one. It's to do with metaphysical possibility. Standardly, people trying to theorize about causation in these interventionist terms will make it a requirement on any legitimate causal model that the variable values should be kind of independent of one another. I mean, they're trying explicitly to exclude grounding type connections between some model variables. So it's a bad model if you don't have metaphysical modal independence of all the variables. And if you want to model grounding in this way, you just have to give up that constraint. So what, I think? I mean, so what my imaginary grounding fan says. The kinds of some combinations of the variable values in these grounding models are going to be metaphysically impossible, no problem. Some of the interventions you need to make to get those combinations of values are going to be metaphysically impossible, no problem. We can think quite coherently, you might say, about the metaphysically impossible. Like, what would be the case if there was a round square? Well, there'd be a round square. It would be square and it would be round. So if you're prepared to take those kinds of counterpossible suppositions seriously, I don't think this need to be a problem for you at all. And without going into it in detail, I think it's fairly clear that these sorts of grounding models will involve ubiquitous counterpossible counterfactual dependencies. So some of the counterfactuals that characterize the model will always be counterpossibles. And sometimes you get that in the positive direction. So where the grounding fact is metaphysically necessary, for example, anything that it grounds is going to be metaphysically necessary too. It's going to be impossible to suppose that it not be the case, so it'd be impossible to intervene on it. But the kinds of cases which really make it ubiquitous and unavoidable that grounding is going to involve counterpossible dependence are the reverse dependencies. So remember that we needed to rule out the backwards dependencies in order to have a one-way kind of grounding connection. So we wanted causation to run generally from the past to the future. We want grounds generally to run from, roughly speaking, more fundamental to less fundamental. And so we want grounding to be asymmetric, which means that we need the grounding counterfactuals, the interventionist counterfactuals, to hold in one direction and not another. We need it to be the case that if we were to intervene over here, this stuff would be different. We need it to be false that if we were to intervene over here, this stuff would be different, because it's true on this way of assessing counterfactuals, thinking about grounding, that if you intervene on this thing remains unaffected because it's upstream in the model. So in order to intervene on this thing and leave this one unaffected, you have to break this connection here. But it's characteristic, at least of full grounding, that those connections hold with metaphysical necessity. So if you need to break a grounding connection in order to make your intervention, then if that connection is a connection of full grounding, then you're going to end up considering a metaphysically impossible scenario. Okay. So you can form this into an argument. If this way of modeling grounding is right, and if there are some genuine cases of non-trivial grounding like this one, then we're going to have some false counterpossibles, which obviously entails that not all counterpossibles are trivially true. So is that a worry? Well, the view that counterpossibles are trivially true is pretty widespread. So Lewis, Staunacker, and Williamson, between them, pretty good pedigree for this view. So my diagnosis of what's going on here, this is the kind of diagnosis that I offered of why some people are grounding skeptics without always being able to exactly put their finger on why they're skeptical about grounding. So the kind of situation I was in before I really looked into the literature, I kind of thought there's got to be something wrong with grounding, but I can't quite tell what. This is what I think I was getting at all that time. This thought that taking grounding seriously, thinking there are non-trivial cases of grounding, commits you to distinctions in truth values between counterpossible conditionals. But I was brought up in Oxford in this Williamson kind of bubble to believe that it's just obvious that counterpossibles are all trivially true. So I could see that a view that I took as axiomatic was going to run into contact. I could see dimly that this view was going to run into contact with grounding, and that's why I was suspicious of grounding. That's my self-diagnosis, and I think maybe other people think along the same lines. So certainly these three people have all been, these two have been in print about being skeptical about grounding or related notions. Williamson's confirmed to me in conversation that he is skeptical about grounding. So I want to put forward this kind of this kind of vague, not vague, this a kind of general, widespread, but not universal correlation between people that are skeptical about counterpossible counterfactuals having non-trivial truth values and people that are skeptical about grounding. I think those two things go together, and I think there's a causal explanation there. Okay, so kind of just wrap up 5 or so minutes to, with those ingredients on the table, and kind of in a position to put forward a positive suggestion about what grounding might be for those people that aren't put off it by its connections with counterpossible counterfactuals. So I'm just assuming kind of for now that connection is established, and I want to use it to distinguish between the kind of causation which is grounding and the kind of causation which is ordinary causation or physical causation. So I have this, I'm taking my cue from it's kind of a throwaway remark of Schaffer's. He doesn't really mean it when he says this. He says it's something like it, but it's not, really it's a different thing that just has certain, grounding and causation just have certain things in common. Why do they have them in common? Don't ask me, maybe they're some kind of determination relation or something like, directed determination relation. I think he uses that phrase. But I'm thinking that causation might just be the genus here, and that there are specific kinds of causation, the ordinary physical kind that we're familiar with, and grounding, the metaphysical kind. And so then it's not at all surprising that grounding and causation of the kind we're familiar with have the same formal features, because grounding is just a kind of causation. So I'm distinguishing between these two kinds of causation by whether the connection holds contingently or non-contingently. So if we're thinking about full ground, it's usually assumed that the full grounds for something necessitate that thing. I know there are people who deny that, but it's kind of pretty orthodox, and I'm assuming it for these purposes. So on this view, we can distinguish very neatly between ground and causation. Cases, at least, of full ground are cases where A causes B and that fact is non-contingent. So the fact that A causes B is a non-contingent matter for cases of full ground. Whereas for cases of physical causation, A can be a sufficient cause of B, but that fact is a contingent matter. Okay. So all I'm doing here is appealing to this distinction we already understand between contingent and non-contingent subject matters in order to distinguish between grounding and causation. So the thought is it's kind of a single bit of ideology that has some contingent instances and some non-contingent instances, which explains why we think kind of why there's such an extensive analogy between these two notions. So what's nice about this? Well, it's ideologically parsimonious. We only have the same basic notion, something like intervention or cause. We just need to have that once, and we can use that to understand both grounding and causation. And any story we have about how causation is explanatory will carry over to grounding. Maybe we don't have any good such story. Maybe that's a problem. But if we do, it should carry over. So the kind of inference is the best explanation. It would be really theoretically nice and neat if grounding and causation, if grounding was a kind of causation. It would explain all the similarities. It allows us to offer this diagnosis of scepticism about grounding, which I find a quite plausible diagnosis, and I think that's a reason to adopt this view of grounding. It allows for this diagnosis. Other people aren't so keen to see this as a reason to adopt that view of grounding. And you can have these mixed causal networks I drew attention to. It's kind of hard to understand how that would be possible if there was a real fundamental difference between these two kinds of thing, grounding and causation. I mean, you'd have to say that those causal networks just kind of completely fail to represent the structure of reality, whereas each network on its own does represent the structure of reality. Okay, so there are various ways you can challenge this. You can respond to them using Hall's production dependence distinction if you want. I'm going to skip over all of that. Lots of reasons to believe that grounding is a kind of causation. I'm not myself convinced, but I think if I was a friend of counterpossible counterfactuals having non-trivial truth values, I would be convinced. So I want to invite you to either be skeptical of non-trivial counterpossible counterfactuals and join me in being skeptical also of grounding, or I want to invite you to relax about counterpossible counterfactuals and then take seriously this analysis of grounding which appeals to them. It'll be a non-reductive analysis like the interventionist analysis of causation, but it will hopefully be informative like most people think the interventionist analysis of causation. Okay, that's everything. I hope you can read these. Sorry about that. Cheers.